Margaret Preston was ahead of her time. She cried out for an authentic Australian art when her fellow artists were taking the traditional path to Britain and France. She was a modernist and a feminist at a time when women knew their place. While many of her male colleagues were described as dull, Preston was anything but. A retrospective of Margaret Preston's work is now showing at the National Gallery of Victoria. Actress Lucy Bell is the voice of Margaret Preston.
It has been said that modern art is international, but it is important for a great nation to make a cultural stand. My wish is to see a combined attempt by our artists to give us an art that no other country in the world can produce.
Margaret Preston was born in 1875 and she was a professional artist by the 1890s and a teacher in Adelaide, but it's probably not till the 1920s that she became centrally important to Australian art traditions. She evolved an idea of a modern national art and a desire to produce a new form of Australian painting, I suppose, that was appropriate to a new post-war Australian society.
She wasn't boring, and so many of the big-name Australian male painters in the interwar period, when you looked at the work, they were dull, dull, dull. And she was not only not dull at any time, she kept on changing, finding new ways to explore. Margaret Preston begins as a traditional art school student, as she says, painting eggs and brass and silver and china, all the different textures on the one canvas. Then she goes to Europe and she encounters a whole different way that is emerging in modernism in Europe, and she begins to absorb that.
We were still so closely aligned to Britain and artistically to France that artists saw their success in terms of exhibiting success in the salons and the academies in Britain and France. And so she did precisely what many of her colleagues were doing if they could afford it. She got herself to Paris and to London.
I fled from country to country, hunting an ideal, and finally decided to come back to Australia. I had learned to think, so the passage money was not wasted. Australia is a fine place to think. The galleries are so well fenced in, the theatres and cinemas are so well fenced in, the universities are so well fenced in. You do not get bothered with foolish new ideas. Tradition thinks for you, but heavens, how dull.
She was very opinionated. At the same time, a lot of people say what a humble woman she was. She had huge ambitions, and yet she always painted on a modest scale. She wanted to succeed, but she chose very early on to paint as a still life painter, which is a genre that has been and maybe continues to be quite marginalised in the history of Australian art. So she was complex in that way. So for all of the feistiness of Margaret Preston, I think there was probably quite a strong reflective side as well.
The most important thing about Preston is that she believed in a sort of a democracy of modernism, that modernism could enter everybody's life and therefore make people aware of the importance of art.
The idea was, her very strong idea was, that she provide her paintings cheaply, and particularly her prints were made as very cheap original artworks that young people, modest income people, a whole range of people could get into their houses. And the idea is, if you looked at one of her prints or paintings on your walls every day, you would start to think about the large questions that she was thinking about. What is a national art? What is an Australian identity? That kind of thing.
When I'm painting flowers, I'll pull one of its kind to pieces. I will know exactly how it's formed. When I've done this, I draw from another one. I do this with all my flowers. I make studies of them. I then put the studies entirely away from me and make my compositions.
From the mid-20s, she's painting Australian flowers, and she's painting them with what she sees as an Australian palette, using only those tones that she can find in Australian flowers and in Australian land. She begins to recognise also how scruffy the Australian bush is.
She saw, as I said, Australia as a land of stark white light. She saw it as a land of basically dull colours, of extremely old geographical forms, and she was looking to see how she could express those in the vehicle of the still life. And that drive took her very quickly to Aboriginal art.
I'm personally aiming at the simplification of all forms and to express the monumental form and dry colour of Australian landscapes. I wish to continue the basic work of the Aborigines. What I am after in my work is to give the national, spiritual and characteristic features of this country.
Her mistake, if you like, and her problem, if you like, was that she always thought that it was going to be white Australian artists who forged this national vision. She didn't understand or could see how Aboriginal artists themselves might be involved in that process. And of course, it was very soon after her death that Aboriginal artists themselves repossessed the territory, if you like, that Margaret Preston had tried to acquire.
But for her, everything had to be what you could then do here, that in the lines that Tom Roberts had said about his early paintings as well. You make art for one time and one place, and then you make art that can be viewed in all times and all places. But certainly the place in which she thought she could add something to the store of artistic achievement was what she could do with Australian themes and materials.
Distinctive Australian art, that report produced by Catherine Hunter. Margaret